Greece is, quote, headed for a painful exit from the European Union. That's the warning from the country's central bank. It says that Greece will default on its debts unless the Greek government and its international creditors reach a deal on economic reforms. The country has until June 30th to make a 1.6 billion euro payment to the International Monetary Fund, but officials say that they don't have the cash. And for 3 years, the European Union has been propping up the Greek economy, lending the country billions of euros at a time so that Athens can repay its government debt. In exchange, Greece has implemented austerity measures to reduce its dependence on the borrowed cash, but now the Greek government says that those austerity measures are too severe and has demanded more favorable terms. So, who would a Grexit hurt the most, Greece or Europe? To break it all down, we're now joined by Christian Odenhall, the chief economist at the Center for European Reform in London, Matthew Tsimitzakis, a freelance journalist in Athens, and Howard Feynman, HuffPost Global Editorial Director from Washington, D.C. So I want to thank you all for joining me today. And, Christian, perhaps you could just start us off by backtracking a little bit. I feel like anytime you look at a newspaper or look online these days, there's a very alarming headline about Greece being on the brink of financial disaster. How did this all begin, though? Take us back a couple of years, will you?
Sure. So Greece was is part of a monetary union, and being part of a monetary union is a bit of a challenge. And up until 2010, it all went relatively well. Then it turned out that Greece had overborrowed and overspent. It had a huge current account and fiscal deficit, and markets lost trust in the Greek government's ability to repay debt. So it lost market access. And from that point on, it needed funding from outside, be it the IMF or the European partners. And ever since then, it has been a bargaining process between the Greek government and its European partners and the IMF in terms of what Greece needs to do in terms of reform, but mostly in terms of cutting the fiscal deficit. And that has hurt the Greek economy quite severely. And that is why we are at this point now. Most of the plans at some point went out the window because the conditions, as you said in your introduction, were quite severe.
The thing is that there's also been a lot of finger pointing and a lot of blame thrown around in this situation too, right? Is Greece at fault for spending irresponsibly and having, too lavish a public program and being dependent on it? Or is this part of the problem of having a monetary union as such to where countries really don't have enough control over their own individual economies?
I think both is right. I'm sure that the Greek state and the Greek government have to share some of the blame in the run-up to the crisis in 2010. As you rightly say, being part of the monetary union is very, very difficult if you are in crisis. But part of the blame also needs to go to the institutions, namely the IMF and the other European countries, for imposing conditions on Greece that from the outset many believed were unrealistic and would crush the economy. And this is exactly what happened. So I don't think I'm in these kinds of crises that tend to be blame games, but I don't think we should engage in any of those.
So, Howard, why is it now that Greece is saying that they've had enough? What's changed?
Well, I think the politics, from what I can see from here and what people at the State Department and elsewhere tell me, is that the new Greek government politically has gone about as far as it can go. And if it attempts to go further, it risks the already surprisingly diminishing credibility that it has with the Greek people. I think there's concern among the leaders of the negotiations on the Greek side that they wouldn't be able to sell any new measures to the Greek people. And maybe those leaders can be blamed for not having the guts to try it, but they don't seem willing to try it. And I think also they genuinely believe they've gone as far as they can. I would also say that there's some brinksmanship going on here. They say they don't have the money. They say they can't pay. That is probably true. But we still have until the end of the month. And sort of like somebody who's arguing to be allowed some extra time to pay the rent in their apartment, maybe the Greeks are taking this up to the very last minute in hopes of getting something better.
That's right. And it seems like all along the way, too, there have been exceptions that have been made. There have been loopholes that have been taken advantage of. What are the possibilities here? Is a June 30th deadline really a deadline?
Well, it's a deadline until it's not. At this point, it's the line in the sand that's been drawn. But I don't think that global financial leaders are kidding, including Janet Yellen, the head of the U.S. Federal Reserve, who just said a few minutes ago, a couple hours ago maybe, that a Greek default would be a very serious matter globally. I don't think global leaders, financial leaders in Europe, including Germany, or in the United States, want to see that happen. I think the sense here, at any rate, in Washington, I don't get any great sense of panic out of the people I talk to about the Greek situation. That may be Pollyannish and naive on their part, but they seem to think that ultimately the Greeks and the Germans and the rest of the Europeans will come to some kind of deal. But what I see also happening is a lot of finger pointing going on, where the Germans are now blaming the international institutions, including the IMF, for not doing more. Simple answer is we don't know yet whether it's going to be a catastrophe or not. But nobody really wants to take the chance of it happening. Although I've got to say that Paul Krugman, among others in the United States, a U.S. analyst here, and others have compared this situation kind of like the 1914. I think that's overly dramatic, when there was a march to folly and a war that nobody thought would ever happen. I don't think we're at that point. I hope we're not at that point, but it's hard to tell.
Well, Matthew, you are there in Athens. Do you sense that there is a panic going on? I know that you just actually came from an anti-austerity protest out there. How would you describe what the people are feeling right now, what you're seeing?
No, I don't think there's panic because people are tired. But at the same time, it's also clear that people cannot take it anymore. I mean, if you only read German Institute, I think it was Karl Beckler or something like that, the lower incomes have been taxed here for 339% more than they were taxed before the crisis in 2009, while the upper incomes are only taxed 9%. The GDP is down by 25%. Unemployment is still at 25, 26%, and poverty is over 30%. So these are figures that are war-like figures, despite the fact that we don't have a war here. So that cannot go on endlessly. It has to stop somewhere. People are very, very tired not to see any prospect for a solution. I mean, and at the end of the day, it would be ridiculous not to find a solution. Allow me that judgment. Alexis Tsipras and his Syriza government have practically agreed to 95% of what the Germans are asking, and they're only asking back for one or two very simple things, and actually very easy to achieve. Follow the IMF's guide to restructure the debt, because we need to have some prospect for growth at some point, and leave the low pensioners alone. They have suffered enough. In effect, the Eurogroup could just end this whole discussion tomorrow, but they won't do it. I mean, for some reason, the Germans seem to want the whole cake the way they want it. They want everything. They want the part of the IMF's guidance that says that Greece needs to continue modernizing its economy by taking severe measures, but not give debt restructuring. It's irrational.
Well, how is it that that people are perceiving the government of and the governing of Alexis Tsipras as well since he's been elected? I mean, this was an election that we saw in the country where he did get swept in with this anti-austerity sentiment and took a very hard line. And so this is why the public voted him in. Do they feel like he is living up to the promises that he made and negotiating on their behalf in good faith right now?
The main advantage of Alexis Tsipras' government is the moral advantage. People recognize that for the first time after maybe 30 years are genuinely represented, whether Tsipras is sufficient in actually implementing his promises, his pre-electoral promises or not. And that is his most significant capital. There's no antagonist on the ground that can compete with Alexis Tsipras in making people feel that he is honest and genuinely representing the people. I think that that's the most important thing right now. Whether he succeeds to implement his Salonika program, a program that is clearly Keynesian, redistributive, it gives the state a role to play in the economy or not, is not the most important thing right now at the moment.
Christian, what do you say to what Matthew was just telling us there? Have the Greeks made a lot of concessions and are not asking that much, and Germany is putting its foot down?
Yes, I think there's a lot of truth in that. Since end of last year, the negotiating position of the creditors and the IMF has basically not moved much at all, whereas the Greeks have made quite a few concessions, and the difference between the Greek side and the creditors is now roughly 2 billion euros, which in the grand scheme of things is peanuts. So if Brexit were really to happen over 2 billion euros, I think history would judge Europe very harshly.
And Howard, you mentioned, of course, that Federal Reserve Chair here in the United States, Janet Yellen, has chimed in on this. We've seen President Obama talk about this over the years, too, because it has been this kind of endless seeming cycle of Greece is on the verge of collapse. At some point, do you feel like people have also stopped taking it as seriously? Because we've heard this warning that Greece is on the verge of default so many times?
No, I think people are skeptical, but they're not going to dismiss it. I think people are aware of the fact that there's some advantages to having a interconnected global capital system, which we have on most of the planet, not all of it, but most of it. That there are many advantages to it, but it also makes us vulnerable to disturbances, shall we say, in one particular part of it. And I don't think people are willing to dismiss as insignificant disruptions to the economic system in the country, in the world, that is, that would result from a Greek default. I think people, with most of their brain, they know that would be something they don't want to risk. They don't want to perform the experiment with the global economy that would result from a Greek default. But yet, as I said, here in the United States, the sort of urgency to help out, the urgency to come riding into the rescue, it isn't there. And I think it's primarily because it's the judgment of the American administration that this is a European problem. But I would say that it isn't completely a European problem. I think it's a world problem. And I think there's probably some more that the U.S. could do and say. What that would be, I'm not precisely sure.
Well, let's also not forget that the IMF, for example, the International Monetary Fund, as well as the World Bank, both headquartered in Washington, D.C. So it's not like they're that far removed from the issue. So is there influence as you see it that they could have?
Well, it's not like the United States is without influence with the IMF and the World Bank. The U.S. doesn't run them exactly. The U.S. doesn't have quite the clout that it once did. But as you say, they're in the neighborhood. Their headquarters are literally within a couple of blocks of the White House. And I don't know the etiquette of this or the diplomatic niceties of it. But if I were President Obama or Secretary of State Jack Lew or even Janet Yellen and I was right down the street, I might want to talk face to face with those people and get their view of what's going on. It's not just a local matter. We're all interconnected. And I think Greece has great symbolic value and history in addition to whatever the size of its economy is. And for the government to be heading over to with its tin cup, so to speak, to go talk to Vladimir Putin and see what he wants to do is not a good sign, and maybe we don't have to take it seriously because the Russians don't have any money. But still, Greece matters in many, many ways, strategically as well as military, as well as financially.
All right, Howard, I believe that you have to leave us now, but I want to thank you for joining us on this conversation today. And Christian, let me pick up where Howard left off there too. What do you say about a position that an outside actor like the United States could try to take here, or would they even do so? If you look at the history of the IMF and the way that they've dealt with any other country dealing with a financial crisis, it has always been through painful austerity measures that have been inflicted.
Well, in part that's true, although the measures that the IMF usually has proposed in such crises also involved currency devaluation, which in the Greek case is not possible. So the IMF has made some adjustments to its thinking about Greece. It has actually admitted to some failings in the past. And I can only mirror what Howard said. The US does have influence. And the US can, for instance, influence Germany and the European Union of taking a slightly softer stance in order to help Greece back on its feet and keep it within the European family.
Matthew, what would it mean right now? What is the choice that the Greek people are really facing at this moment? Is it one of choosing to default on the debt and eventually exit the Eurozone?
Yeah, actually, there are two bad choices here. The one is to abide by the rules of the institutions and continue with internal devaluation, which means more marginalization, more exclusion for larger parts of the population, which is politically and socially unbearable. And the Greek society is really on its limits in regards to that sense. There is, of course, the issue of tax evasion, but that's something to be discussed, and Tsipras is offering a lot on that issue. And the other choice is to exit the euro and issue back the national currency, the drachma, which would be catastrophic for a few years. And now what's happening is that the Greeks are traditionally pro-European. They don't see the European Union only as an economic union. They see it also as a security framework. And they've made the strategic choice to be within the European Union. Syriza itself is a pro-European, is a genuinely pro-European party. So nobody really wants to take things to the extremes. On the other hand, this government is doing administration based more or less on what Paul Krugman has written a few times in the New York Times, that a deal is a good deal up to a certain point, under which it doesn't matter anymore. And they will not go beyond that point. And at this point, I think right now, I think that Tsipras is with his back on the wall, and he really means it when he says that he is not going to take a step back unless the Europeans really mean that they want to keep Greece in the Eurozone. So that's where we are at the moment.
Christian, how do you see this playing out at this point? As we mentioned earlier, a deadline is only a deadline until it's not, until some type of compromise is made.
Yeah, that's true. I think there's. I still think a Greek exit from the Eurozone is unrealistic because no side really wants it. It would be hugely costly for both sides. And the difference in positions between both sides is actually not that not that large. And so I still think that it will be avoided. And the deadline, although it is a relatively hard deadline on the 30th of June, there will be some interim agreement before that.
Got it. And what do you make? I'm just going to ask that same question that I asked to Howard to you as well, too, about how much of this is brinksmanship when it comes to making very dramatic statements about what is about to happen, what is about to occur?
I think there was brinkmanship involved in these negotiations in the past, but as Matthew rightly said, we have come to a point where the Greeks really are with the back to the wall. So it's not really that much brinkmanship on their side at this point. At this point, they are just saying our society can't take any more, and I think they're right on that. And
so, Matthew, do you see a best case scenario? As you said, it's two bad choices that the Greeks have to make here, but what ultimately would look like a good option and a good alternative for bringing the country out of this economic slump?
Well, the way things are at the moment, the best case scenario is to everybody must admit that this is a political issue and find a political solution. The figures are very small not to find a political solution. I just wanted to add one more thing. I read earlier today a note by the Eurasian Consultancy Group. It's a group that consults governments on politics and financial agents and so on. And what they said is that maybe somebody is plotting a political change in Greece. Maybe somebody is thinking, but if Syriza goes, then maybe a friendly government will come. I can assure, having lived here for the past 40 years, I can assure that this is not the case. I mean, There's no credible, there's no possible virtual government that will be credible enough, democratic enough, and will enjoy the acceptance of the majority of the people that can push more austerity forward. You just have to read the numbers to realize that. So, yeah, I think that we're not far from an agreement, despite the dramatic tone. I think that the European Union tends to take decisions on the very last moment, and several times it gives dramatic tones to matters, but I think that maybe an agreement is closer than we think.
All right, well, I certainly hope that you're right in that case, but we'll all have to wait and see what happens next. Christian and Matthew, thank you both for being with us today.
Thank you very much.
All right, guys, stick around. Much more coming up on HuffPost Live.